I will start very quickly by asking Dr. Wagacha to talk us through what the Kenya Sovereign Fund is doing lately. What are your preferred asset classes? What is your mandate? And to the extent that co-investment is interesting and important for you, how do you go about creating partnerships that will bring co-investment capital into Kenya, please?
Okay. Thank you, my chairman. We've had an opportunity to discuss some of the subjects on sovereign wealth funds before with the chairman, with some of you in the audience. I'm very glad to be here and to be able to, I think, very, very much thank the Africa investor, because after we met in New York the last time, and we were given the award of the most innovative sovereign wealth fund on the African continent, that has given a new momentum in Kenya to put the pieces together and to finish the formative stages of the formation of the Kenya Sovereign Wealth Fund. We've got about $3 million US dollars to put together the architecture, put in a board of directors, put in a CEO, put in fund managers, and establish the guidelines for fund management. And we are very thankful that this gives momentum. This formative stage will soon be passed because the Sovereign Wealth Fund will be signed off. And for startup, Chairman, I would like to report that to go back to our format, which was given heads up in New York, our format has 3 windows. The way we will set it up has 3 windows. One is a recognition that commodities from which much of the sovereign wealth income is gained is volatile. We saw the Africa rising commodity period run from about 2000 to about 2014. Huge amounts of income were earned by major players like Nigeria, like Angola, Botswana. So this terms of trade aspect, which brings in periodically a huge amount of inflow, and then during a famine period of commodity collapse, brings in a period of austerity, is unhealthy. Sovereign wealth funds need to help the countries that they originate from in riding this volatility. So our Sovereign Wealth Fund has a window called the fiscal stabilization window, which allows for observation and management of macro indicators to ensure that you do not have this destabilizing effect. Then we have a window which is named the infrastructure and sector development window. That window is made to invest and to drive stimulus to the infrastructure, to the economic sectors of the economy, especially infrastructure. Unfortunately, as we know, and I remember discussing with some of you in the audience, the president of PTA Bank, my colleague, Mr. Owino there, who was part of the committee that set up the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Kenya. The paradox in Africa is that even if you set aside funds in a sovereign wealth fund for financing infrastructure and sectors, the information on the project's profile is very rare. And there are no sort of institutions that take up the weightlifting to expose the rates of return on major regional projects that are productive and profitable, but whose information is unknown. the amount of information you need to, a sovereign wealth fund needs to fund and to invest in high return projects in Africa is high, and it is specialized. You need, but that information about the rates of return is not known. So you have sovereign wealth funds that are building up funds, accumulating, as my chairman just mentioned in passing, accumulating savings in that window to build infrastructure. Yet you have a continent where the knowledge and the technical knowledge about the rates of return is low. So these sovereign funds may well invest and still make a rate of return, but perhaps even in foreign countries, when your country might be borrowing from abroad in foreign markets. So that disconnect needs to be broken one way or another. And I'll talk about that in a few seconds, my chairman, about how to break the disconnect between accumulating funds in infrastructure and sector development windows and the inability for sovereign funds to technically invest in those projects because the information is not known. The other window that we have is the window called Future Generations window. And that window, of course, recognizes that resources are depletable. They will not last 1,000 years. So you need to give some push to future generations to rebuild a different economy, to transform into a different economy that may not rely on natural resources. So those are our three windows. Now, what do we need to do? What we've done in our case, if you give me just a few more minutes, is to describe why these windows are different. The fiscal stabilization window is different because it takes account of macro stabilities, volatility in earnings, volatility in the markets, and you want to stabilize the economy so that you are not disrupted by low earnings or peak earnings during high commodity prices. And you want to manage that as technical macroeconomics experts, to ensure that that window takes care of instability. So the guidelines are mostly macro indicators and macro management. The window so the guidelines about how you spend from that window, which is about 30% of the total revenues, is mostly macro fiscal stabilization. The second window on infrastructure and sectors basically assumes that when you get projects to invest in domestically or even regionally, and you have the technical comfort and all the information is in, and you invest in those projects, you need sufficient liquidity. It's about ensuring that the project cycle is followed and that you pay your bills on time and that there's sufficient liquidity in that window to ensure that projects are done, completed, and that a sovereign wealth fund earns its promised rate of return. That's the main point. So sufficient liquidity, perhaps shorter maturities, but you ensure that that window is managed in such a way that your returns are accounted for. The final window, which is the future generations window, the main impetus in that window is to ensure that if you are promising future generations some part in the current management of the sovereign wealth fund, then you must secure the purchasing power of that window. Your inflation-adjusted rates of return in that window should never reflect a fall in purchasing power for future generations. That's the main purpose. But now let me come to the final challenge of how you get out information about the rates of return in our region, even domestically, to ensure that investments, that sovereign funds are in sync with domestic policies on the continent. The main thing, as I said, is the paradox that there are accumulations, but the technical information is not available. And when it is generated by, say, technical experts, then the problem is that then if they do the work, then there's a problem of propriety. They keep that information. They'll tend to generate information and keep it for their own purposes. So that is a problem. So we need to develop and open up information on investable projects in such a way that that information is accessible, is not proprietary information, and it can be accessed by sovereign wealth funds, by investors, etc. So what we have to do, in my view, and I think Africa Investor can be part and parcel of that, of generating that debate, is to ensure that that information is hosted in a fairly transparent organization. Africa Development Bank, PTA Development Bank, Africa at 50, we should host either a secretariat in place or a few experts that generate that information and publish that information, so that any investor in the world in a domestic high rate of return project in East Africa, in Central Africa, etc., can then access that information without proprietary hindrances and be able to continue.
We'll come to that, Dr.
Yeah.
I think. Let me just take from comments from Mbui, and then we'll just do a round, go back again, so we can talk about how to get everyone to work together. I think
I'll
that's
close
important.
on that note by my chairman and hand over the baton.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I will say that I will congratulate you on getting the funding to get the fund up and running. I think I have good news and bad news for you, because I've been down this path for 4 years, setting up the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. The good news is you have a chance to build everything you've described. The bad news is you actually have to build it. And I think, and I'm speaking from somebody who has actually done all these three funds, and it's an exciting opportunity that Kenya is trying to build it. So as you develop it, the good news is across this room, there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of people that are willing to help and have all some of this information that you're requesting that we can all pull together.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.